Picture a ship about to leave the coast of Troy. It carries men who just survived 10 years of war, who know how to fight, how to endure, how to read the intentions of enemies. What they are about to face is something different. Not an army, not a siege, the open sea. The Odyssey is one of the oldest stories in the Western world, and for most people it reads exactly like what it appears to be. A mythological adventure full of one-eyed giants, enchantresses, and monsters waiting in the dark water. But there is another way to read it. Strip away the supernatural framing, pay attention to the geography, the weather patterns, the biology, and the seamanship, and the poem starts to look less like fantasy and more like a remarkably detailed catalogue of everything that could go wrong on a voyage through the ancient Mediterranean. That is the question this video is going to pursue. Was Homer's world of monsters actually a sailor's hazard map? Did each terrifying creature, each strange encounter, each coast that swallowed ships whole, did all of it encode a real maritime danger that ancient Greek sailors needed to understand, fear, and survive? The case for yes is surprisingly strong. Consider what Odysseus and his crew were working with. Greek vessels of the period were modest merchant ships, roughly 20 meters long, built for coastal navigation because venturing too far from land meant losing all reference points in an era before compasses or reliable charts. These ships were highly vulnerable. A sudden wind shift could overwhelm a crew in minutes. A hidden reef could tear a hull open before anyone on board understood what had happened. And the Mediterranean, for all its reputation as a cradle of civilization, is a genuinely dangerous seascape. The Strait of Messina, just 2 miles wide at its narrowest point, generates currents that ancient pilots described as lethal. Regional storms in the Mediterranean can reach hurricane force, with wind speeds documented at around 110 kilometers per hour. Unfamiliar coastlines concealed reefs, hostile peoples, and natural traps that no amount of bravery could overcome once a ship was already inside them. Odysseus sails directly through all of it. He begins with the Lotus-eaters, a people living on a coast where a fruit grows that makes men forget why they left home. That fruit, researchers now believe, is most likely the wild jujube, Ziziphus lotus, a plant native to North Africa and the Mediterranean basin, whose fermented pulp produces genuine mild intoxication. A crew that stops on an unfamiliar coast, eats something offered by locals and loses its will to continue. That is not fantasy. That is a very specific kind of danger. Then comes the Cyclops, a giant on a volcanic island who traps men in a cave and picks them off one by one. Then Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, who hands Odysseus a bag containing every storm that could destroy him, and the bag gets opened at the worst possible moment. Then the Laestrygonians, who appear hospitable until they reveal themselves as something far worse, and almost every ship in the fleet is destroyed. Then the Sirens, whose voices draw sailors onto rocks. Then Scylla, a monster at a cliff face who snatches men directly off the deck. Then Charybdis, a whirlpool in a narrow strait that swallows the sea itself and spits it back 3 times a day. Each of these, as we will examine in detail, has a real-world candidate. Scylla's cliff sits at the edge of the Strait of Messina, where the sheer rock faces along the Calabrian coast match the description almost exactly, and Charybdis corresponds to a measurable, periodically violent whirlpool in the same strait, still a documented hazard for modern vessels. Acoustic tests at islands off the Amalfi coast suggest that monk seal vocalizations, amplified by twin rock formations, produce exactly the kind of haunting sound that could drag a ship off course. The Cyclops legend may trace back to fossil elephant skulls discovered in Sicily, whose large central nasal cavity looks startlingly like a single giant eye socket, leading ancient people to construct a mythology around bones they could not otherwise explain. And the sea monsters themselves, the creatures that attack ships in open water, line up with encounters with large baleen whales, fin whales or minke whales, whose size, spouting and feeding behaviour would have been genuinely terrifying to sailors in small wooden vessels who had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. What this video is going to do, episode by episode, is test each encounter against 4 disciplines: geography, biology, archaeology, and ancient seamanship. Where the evidence is solid, we will say so. Where it is genuinely contested, and some of it is, we will acknowledge that too, because the goal is not to flatten myth into simple explanation. The goal is to understand why these particular stories survived, why sailors kept telling them, and why the fears encoded in a poem composed nearly 3,000 years ago still map almost perfectly onto the dangers any navigator would encounter on that same route today. The monsters were real. The names were different. Let's find them. Before we examine the individual monsters, we need to understand the mechanism. Why would sailors encode practical warnings in the form of mythological creatures at all? Why not simply say, the cliff at the northern end of the strait will kill you, the current beneath it will pull you under, stay to the eastern side and do not slow your oars? Why invent Scylla and Charybdis when a straightforward sailing instruction would seem to do the same job? The answer is that a straightforward sailing instruction on its own does not survive. Ancient Greek sailors operated entirely within an oral culture. There were no printed charts, no navigational manuals, no written tide tables pinned to the mast. Knowledge moved the way. All knowledge moved in that world. Through story, through repetition, through the structured act of telling and retelling, in a form memorable enough to survive transmission across generations and across the open water between ports. A list of hazards fades. A story about a 6-headed monster who reaches down from the cliff face and pulls men directly off the deck. That stays with you. It stays with your crew. It stays with the next crew who hears it told at a harbour before they make the same passage. This is what scholars working in geomythology have identified as the deep function of mythic narrative in ancient seafaring cultures. Oral traditions do not preserve hazard information despite their supernatural framing. They preserve it because of it. The monster is not a failure of understanding. The monster is a technology of memory. Think about how Greek sailors actually accumulated and transmitted their knowledge of the sea. Jan-Paul Krilard's research into ancient Greek navigation describes how oral stories functioned as cognitive maps, allowing experienced navigators to pass the memory of specific coastlines, currents, and dangers to crews who had never visited those locations. The Odyssey itself is rich with exactly this kind of detail. References to islands that are windy or rocky, to coasts that are well located for shelter, to waters that behave in particular and dangerous ways. These qualitative cues are the kind of information a navigator needs when instruments do not exist. They are the kind of information that must be encoded in a form that will not be forgotten under stress, on a dark water passage 3 days from the nearest port. Monsters are extraordinarily effective at encoding exactly that kind of information, for reasons that are almost neurological. Human memory retains threatening, vivid, emotionally charged narratives at far higher rates than neutral factual lists. A hazard dressed in the body of a monster exploits every tool the human brain uses to hold on to what matters. The cliff is not just dangerous, it hungers. The whirlpool does not just occur periodically, it breathes, drawing the sea down into itself and blasting it back out 3 times each day, and if you are still in the water when it exhales, you're gone. The Charybdis description in the Odyssey, a vortex that pulls in and releases the sea in periodic cycles, is not poetic invention. It is a functional description of the measurable current behaviour in the Strait of Messina, where tidal and hydrodynamic forces still produce vortex phenomena documented as genuine hazards for modern vessels. The mythic framing made that description unforgettable. The navigational content made it worth remembering. What this means is that we have to resist two opposite errors when reading the Odyssey as a hazard document. The first error is literalism, treating the poem as straightforward, factual reporting dressed in dramatic language, as though Homer was simply being colourful about things he saw clearly. The second error is pure symbolism, dismissing the monsters as cultural expression that tells us about ancient psychology while telling us nothing about ancient geography. The truth sits precisely between those positions, and it is more interesting than either. Ancient sailors almost certainly did not believe in a literal and credulous sense that a six-headed creature lived on a cliff above the Strait of Messina, but neither did they treat Scylla as a purely decorative metaphor with no navigational content. The mythic framing was a vehicle, and the vehicle carried real cargo. When a sailor heard the Scylla episode, he was receiving a warning about a specific class of hazard, an exposed cliff face in a narrow, fast-moving strait, where a helmsman navigating the Charybdis side might be forced too close to the rock wall, where a misjudged course or a sudden wind shift could bring the hull into contact with stone, and where the violence of that contact would be too fast and too complete for a crew to recover from. All of that is inside the story. The monster is the delivery mechanism. This distinction between literal belief and practical transmission is important, because it changes how we evaluate the Odyssey as a document. The poem is not making truth claims in the sense that a modern scientific paper makes truth claims, but it is making knowledge claims. It is asserting that certain dangers exist in certain places and behave in certain ways, and it is asserting this in a form precise enough to survive the journey from one experienced navigator to a crew of novices without losing its essential content. That is a sophisticated act of knowledge management, and it is not an accident that the Mediterranean sailors who lived with these hazards produced the vehicle that preserved them. Consider the specific type of hazards that tend to get assigned to monsters in the Odyssey, because the pattern is not random. The dangers that receive the most elaborate mythic treatment are precisely the dangers that are hardest to describe accurately without some vivid, memorable hook. A storm is difficult to miss. You feel it coming, you see it on the horizon, the wind tells you before it arrives, but the Strait of Messina's lethal cliffs and its whirlpool are localized, partly invisible and dependent on conditions, current state, wind direction, time of passage, that can make the same stretch of water safe on one transit and catastrophic on the next. The Sirens hazard, as we will examine later, involves acoustic deception at a location where hidden reefs sit just below the surface. The Laestrygonians destroy the fleet inside a harbour, a place that should mean safety. These are all invisible hazards, or hazards that disguise themselves as something else. They are exactly the kind of danger that a simple physical description struggles to capture, and that a monstrous personification holds with perfect clarity. The Odyssey in this reading is not primarily a literary achievement that happens to contain some maritime detail. It is an accumulation of Mediterranean seafaring experience, some of it ancient even when Homer composed the poem, some of it layered across generations of sailors who encountered these same coasts and waters and added their testimony to the narrative tradition, shaped into a form that oral transmission could carry without corruption across time and distance. Homer, whoever Homer was, may have been less an inventor than an editor of something that already existed in the knowledge of people who sailed for a living. This matters for the rest of what we're going to examine, because it sets the terms of the investigation. We're not going to be looking for hidden codes, or forcing every mythic element into a one-to-one correspondence with a single real-world object. The relationship between myth and maritime hazard in the Odyssey is more fluid and more interesting than that. Some of the correspondences are tight. Charybdis's periodic behaviour matches the Messina vortex with a precision that is difficult to explain as coincidence. Others are suggestive rather than definitive. The Sirens and the monk seals, for instance, the acoustic experiments at the Ligali Islands are genuinely compelling. but that interpretation competes with others, and the honest answer is that we do not know exactly which natural phenomenon anchored that particular story. What we do know is that the story encodes a real type of hazard, an acoustic or perceptual lure that draws a navigator toward a coast that looks passable and is not. The method, then, is this. For each encounter in the Odyssey, we will ask what class of maritime hazard the monster most plausibly represents, what the physical and geographical evidence looks like, what ancient sailors would have understood from the narrative that we can verify against real-world conditions, and where the evidence is genuinely uncertain, we will say so without pretending otherwise. What we will find, encounter by encounter, is that the monsters are not scattered randomly across a fictional landscape. They cluster along a route. They correspond to specific types of geography. They encode the most lethal features of a real passage through a real sea that was already old and well-travelled and deeply feared when the poem was first composed. The sailors who told these stories were not credulous. They were careful. And the first proof of that care is the fact that the monsters are still there, waiting, in the same waters, doing exactly what the poem says they do. So where exactly is this voyage taking place? Odysseus leaves Troy on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor and, in the poem's logic, never quite makes it straight home to Ithaca off the western coast of Greece. Instead, he gets pushed far off course, and the wandering that follows covers a geography that ancient readers debated almost immediately, and that modern scholars are still actively arguing about. But here is the critical point. The debate is about precise identification, not about regional pattern, and the regional pattern is unambiguous. Odysseus is sailing the central Mediterranean. He is operating in the waters bounded by Sicily, the southern Italian coast, the North African shore, and the island chains that sit between them. That is the corridor. That is where the monsters live. The earliest serious attempt to pin specific episodes to specific locations comes from the Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC. He was not guessing blindly. Polybius was a careful, empirically minded writer who had access to navigational knowledge and geographic sources that no longer survive, and he made 2 identifications that have held up remarkably well. He placed Scylla and Charybdis squarely in the Strait of Messina, the narrow channel between Sicily and the toe of the Italian peninsula, and he linked the Lotus-eaters to the island now called Gerba, off the coast of Tunisia. These are the earliest concrete geographic anchors for the Odyssey's route, and both of them have continued to attract serious scholarly support precisely because the physical evidence at those locations is so compelling. Working outward from Polybius, a broadly consistent itinerary begins to emerge. After leaving the Aegean and touching Ismarus on the Thracian coast, Odysseus gets blown south and west. The Lotus-eaters appear somewhere along the North African littoral. Gerba is the most frequently proposed site, though some scholars place the encounter further west in Libya, and the honest answer is that the identification remains open. From there, the fleet moves north towards Sicily, where the Cyclops episode is most often set in the volcanic southeast of the island, in the shadow of Etna. Then north again along Sicily's coast to the Aeolian Islands, the volcanic archipelago that still bears the name of Aeolus, the keeper of winds, before whatever catastrophe scatters the fleet sends Odysseus further into the Tyrrhenian Sea. Circe is frequently placed on Ischia, or one of the other islands off the Campanian coast. The Sirens are associated with Cape Faro at the northeastern tip of Sicily, or with the Sirens headlands on the Italian coast near Sorrento, and then the voyage funnels into the Strait of Messina, where Scylla and Charybdis wait in the Narrows. After Sicily comes the open Ionian, with Ogygia sometimes identified as Gozo near Malta and Scheria as Corfu, before the final passage home to Ithaca. Laid out like this, the route traces a recognizable arc through the central Mediterranean sailing corridors that ancient mariners actually used. It is not random wandering. It follows the coastlines and island chains that Greek and Phoenician sailors were already navigating by the time the Homeric poems took their final form in the 8th century BC. The seasonal rhythm of ancient navigation reinforces this. Sailors in antiquity hugged coasts in summer, avoided open water transits in winter, and moved through the same repeating sequence of landmarks, anchorages, and passages that the Odyssey describes. The poem's clustering of its most dangerous episodes along the Sicilian and Italian shoreline is not a literary decision. It is a reflection of where sailors actually went and what they actually encountered when they got there, but this is precisely where the uncertainty has to be stated clearly, because the temptation to over-specify is strong and the evidence does not support it. Some scholars locate the Lotus-eaters not in Gerba, but further along the Libyan coast. The Cyclops appears in multiple proposed Sicilian settings. The Sirens have been assigned to at least 3 different Italian headlands, with different researchers marshalling different physical evidence for each. Ancient map-making compounded the problem. Ptolemy's geographic coordinates, the best systematic record of ancient geographic knowledge we have, are distorted by a miscalculation of the Earth's circumference that stretches east-west distances in ways that make precise modern transposition unreliable. Exact site identifications, then, are working hypotheses, not solved problems. The regional pattern matters. The specific addresses remain contested. What survives the uncertainty is something more useful for understanding the poem as a maritime document, an understanding of the types of coastal hazards that define this particular sailing corridor. Ancient sailors working these waters faced a specific and recurring menu of dangers that any experienced navigator would have recognized. Lee shores were among the most feared. Coastlines, where prevailing winds pushed a ship toward rocks, with no room to maneuver away. The volcanic southern Italian and Sicilian coasts are studded with exactly these configurations. Cliffs rising directly from water that offers no shelter and no second chance if a wind shift catches you at the wrong angle. Hidden reefs were equally lethal and more insidious because they disguise themselves. A coastline can look approachable, calm water, manageable depth, right up to the moment a keel strikes stone. Deceptive harbours were the inland version of the same trap. An inlet that appears to offer shelter but is surrounded by cliffs or reef that prevents any exit if conditions change, turning a refuge into a killing ground. Narrows like Messina imposed their own particular violence, concentrating tidal currents to speeds that could overwhelm oared vessels and creating the kind of vortex phenomena that the Charybdis myth encodes with such startling accuracy. The strait narrows to just over 3 kilometers at its tightest point, and its hydrodynamics still generate periodic whirlpool behavior measurable by modern instruments. These are not mythological dangers. They are hydrological and geological realities that persisted from Homer's time to the age of sail, and remain significant enough that modern vessels navigating the Messina Strait still account for the currents. The poem does not invent these hazards. It maps them onto a route that experienced sailors already knew to fear, and it gives each hazard a face memorable enough to ensure that the warning travelled. The geography of the Odyssey, then, is not a decorative backdrop. It is the architecture of the poem's practical content. Every monster we're about to examine lives somewhere specific, somewhere that can be pointed to on a chart, debated, argued over, and in most cases located within a region that makes immediate sense to anyone who has studied ancient Mediterranean navigation. The wandering is not random. It is a guided tour of the most dangerous waters in the ancient sailor's world, presented in a sequence that follows the actual sailing routes, shaped by the actual hazards, and encoded in mythic form precisely so that no one who heard it would ever feel confident enough to ignore it. The monsters are ahead, and most of them are already on the map. The first monster Odysseus meets on that route is not fanged, not tentacled, not armed with anything more threatening than a piece of fruit. That is what makes it so dangerous. After a storm pushes the fleet south and west from the Aegean, the ships make landfall on a coast that Homer describes with deliberate vagueness, a shore where a people called the Lotus-eaters live, a people who do not attack, do not threaten, do not raise weapons. They simply offer food. 3 of Odysseus's men accept it. They eat the lotus, and something changes in them immediately. Not violence, not fever, not madness in any dramatic sense, just a quiet dissolution of intent. They forget Troy. They forget Ithaca. They forget the ships. They want with a serene and total completeness to stay exactly where they are. Odysseus has to drag them back by force. He describes it in Book 9 without sentiment. He fastens them under the rowing benches, physically restrained, weeping, while the rest of the crew gets the ships off the beach and out to sea before anyone else can taste the fruit. The mission survives, but only because Odysseus understands something that the 3 men under the benches no longer can, that a crew that does not want to go home is, for all practical purposes, already lost. The identification that matters here is botanical. Scholars have proposed several candidates for the mythic lotus over the centuries: water lilies, Egyptian lotus, various flowering plants. But the preponderance of linguistic and archaeological evidence points to a specific Mediterranean shrub, Ziziphus lotus, the wild jujube. It is a small, scraggly plant by appearance, not impressive, native to the North African coast, and found in abundance along the Libyan and Tunisian shoreline. Jerba, the island off the coast of Tunisia that the Greek historian Polybius identified as the Lotus-eaters' territory, and that we noted as one of the earliest and most durable geographic anchors for the Odyssey's route, is still home to this plant. Travellers in antiquity noted it consistently enough that the connection between this particular coastline and this particular fruit was already a commonplace by the classical period. The fruit itself is sweet, not unlike a date in texture, mild enough to eat freely without suspicion. But what ancient sources describe is not the raw fruit alone. Dioscorides, the 1st century Greek physician, and Polybius both document the practice of crushing the drupes, soaking the pulp in water and allowing it to ferment into something they compare to wine. A drink made from this maceration that was pleasant, mildly intoxicating, and produced a quality of relaxed apathy that its consumers apparently found difficult to abandon. Modern botanical analysis of fermented Ziziphus lotus pulp confirms that the process can yield a low-alcohol liquid with mild psychoactive properties, enough to produce exactly the kind of dreamy detachment that Homer describes, without anything approaching true amnesia or hallucination. There is no magic in it. There is fermentation, and there is the particular way that mild intoxication dissolves urgency. The myth, in other words, is not describing the impossible. It is describing a real pharmacological effect, stretched to its metaphorical extreme. A man who has been drinking juju wine in the shade of a hospitable shore for long enough is not going to feel compelled to stand up, walk to a boat, and row back into the open sea toward an uncertain future. The fruit does not make him forget home. It makes home feel irrelevant. It makes the immediate comfort of where he is feel sufficient. That is not amnesia. That is intoxication, doing precisely what intoxication does. And this is where the episode stops being botanical curiosity and becomes something navigators would recognize instantly as a nightmare scenario. Any experienced sailor in the ancient Mediterranean world understood the threat of a hospitable shore, not because the shore itself was hostile, but precisely because it was not. A coastline that attacked you with rocks or weather forced a response. It demanded action. But a coastline that offered shade, fresh water, sweet fruit, and the mild warmth of fermented drink was dangerous in a way that demanded nothing at all. And that silence, that absence of demand, was the threat. Men who were exhausted, who had been at oar for weeks, who had been eating hard provisions and sleeping on planking, would not need magic to make them want to stay. They would need leadership, discipline, and the active management of their own desire to rest. Odysseus provides all three, brutally if necessary. The practical consequences of losing crew cohesion on a long-distance voyage were severe and cascading. Ancient merchant and naval crews operated at minimum viable numbers. Losing even a few men to desertion or incapacitation could render a vessel unable to manage its sail, unable to maintain speed, unable to execute the timed maneuvers that narrows and coasts demanded. Beyond the immediate manning crisis, delay itself was a maritime hazard. Mediterranean sailing was seasonal. Windows of safe passage opened and closed with the winds, and a crew that lingered too long on a comfortable shore could miss the favourable conditions that made a particular crossing possible, forcing a choice between a dangerous late-season transit and waiting out an entire winter, during which provisions depleted, the vessel deteriorated, and the political situation at home shifted in ways a captain had no way to monitor or influence. The poem understands this. The Lotus episode is not placed early in the voyage by accident. It appears almost immediately after the fleet leaves familiar waters, before any of the overtly violent encounters, as a structural warning. The first threat to Odysseus's mission is internal, not external. The enemy is comfort. The weapon is a fruit. The casualty, if he fails to act, is not any individual sailor, but the coherence of the entire enterprise. Ancient storytelling almost never wastes an episode. Every encounter in the wandering section of the Odyssey encodes a specific type of maritime danger, and the Lotus episode encodes this one with precision, dependency, delay, and the erosion of will. The transformation from practical naval warning to mythological encounter is modest. Homer simply amplifies a real pharmacological effect into a poetic absolute, where the fruit does not merely reduce the desire to leave, but eliminates it entirely. The mechanism shifts from chemistry to enchantment. The warning remains identical. For a Greek sailor hearing this story around a fire on whatever dock or shoreline he happened to be working, the episode carried a specific professional resonance. You reached a hospitable coast. The locals were generous. The food was sweet. Your crew was tired. And somewhere in that pleasant convergence was a threat that no one would announce, that nothing would announce, that would arrive quietly in the moment when a man looked at the horizon and felt, for the first time in weeks, that he simply did not care what was on the other side of it. That was the monster. That was what made it dangerous. Not teeth, not size, not the roar of any living thing. Just fruit, fermenting in the heat, and the slow softening of the one quality that kept a crew alive on a long voyage, the absolute unrelenting need to go home. From the soft danger of a generous coast, the voyage lurches into something far more brutal. If the Lotus-eaters represent the threat that arrives without a face, what comes next arrives with one eye, a voice like a landslide, and the specific, obliterating terror of being trapped inside a cave with something that wants to eat you. The Polyphemus episode in Book 9 is one of the most detailed encounter sequences in the poem, and its geography is unusually specific. After leaving the Lotus-eaters' shore, Odysseus and his men reach a large island, lush and uninhabited, where they make camp and eat well. The next morning Odysseus takes a single ship and a smaller crew across a narrow channel to the opposite shore, a darker place, wilder, with sea caves hollowed into its cliffs and no sign of cultivation or order. They find the cave, enter it against all reasonable judgment, and wait. What returns with the evening flock is Polyphemus, vast, solitary, contemptuous of the gods, and entirely uninterested in the rules of hospitality that held the Greek world together. He rolls a boulder across the entrance. The crew is sealed in. the exits are gone. What Homer describes, stripped of its mythological scaling, is a masterclass in the specific terror of hostile terrain. The crew of Odysseus cannot fight their way out. The boulder is immovable by human strength. They cannot flee. They are on an island they did not properly scout, in a cave they entered without understanding its single exit, in the dark, with their ships on the wrong side of a channel. Every bad seamanship decision has been made, and now they are paying for all of them simultaneously. The monster is almost secondary to the situation. The monster is what happens when you make landfall carelessly on an unstable coast you do not know. That coast has a strong candidate in the physical record. The volcanic architecture of eastern Sicily, particularly the coastline near what is now Acitrezza, is unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient Greek sailing world. The Farallioni of Acitrezza are massive sea stacks rising directly from the water, columns of dark volcanic basalt that jut from the surface in configurations that look, even to a modern eye, like objects thrown with tremendous force. Local tradition has attached them to Polyphemus, for as long as the tradition can be traced. These are the rocks, the story says, that the Cyclops hurled at the departing ships when Odysseus, having blinded him and escaped, made the catastrophic decision to shout his own name from the water. The rocks fell where they fell. They are still there. The volcanic interpretation carries weight because the landscape earns it. The slopes of Mount Etna rise directly behind this coastline, and the sea caves carved into the lava cliffs by centuries of wave action are exactly the kind of large, dark enclosures the poem describes. This is terrain where rockfall is not mythological, it is geological reality. The coastline shifts, lava fields reach the water, cliffs destabilize. A crew that beached their ships on this shore and moved inland without local knowledge would be navigating through a landscape that offered concealed drops, unstable footing, and the constant low possibility that the mountain itself might contribute to their problems. The isolation is real. The enclosure is real. The sense of entering somewhere that does not want you to leave is not poetic invention. It is the experience of any sailor who has tried to work a hostile volcanic coastline in the dark. But there is a second strand of explanation that runs alongside the volcanic reading, and it does not require fire or lava at all. It requires bone. The dwarf elephant species known as Paleoloxodon falconeri inhabited Sicily and several Mediterranean islands during the Pleistocene, with fossil evidence documenting their presence from roughly 500,000 to around 230,000 years ago. They were not large animals by elephant standards. Dwarfism is a common adaptation in island-bound megafauna, and these creatures were extraordinarily reduced, some standing no higher than a metre at the shoulder. But their skulls were distinctive, and their skulls survived in Sicilian caves in considerable numbers. Bronze Age travellers, moving through these same caves for shelter or storage, would have encountered them. The critical feature is anatomical. An elephant skull, viewed from the front, presents a large central cavity, the nasal opening positioned where the trunk attaches. The actual eye sockets are small and set to the sides of the skull, difficult to identify clearly without zoological training. To an observer who had never seen an elephant, living or dead, the dominant feature of the skull's face would have been that single large central opening, one hole, one massive forward-facing cavity that looks, with no small force of suggestion, exactly like the socket of a single enormous eye. The scholar Adrian Mayer has argued this case in detail, noting that the skull's proportions, massive, rounded, dominated by that central void, are precisely what you would expect an early observer to interpret as the face of a creature built entirely differently from anything they knew. The hypothesis is that fossil finds in Sicilian caves seeded the Cyclops tradition, that ancient people discovered these skulls, drew the reasonable but incorrect conclusion that the central nasal cavity was an ocular socket, and built a mythology around what the creature that wore such a face must have been. One-eyed, enormous, cave-dwelling. This is where honesty about the evidence is necessary. The fossil-to-myth link is debated, and it should be. Some researchers argue that the Cyclops tradition demonstrably predates any documented fossil exposure, making the paleontological explanation a retrospective rationalization rather than a causal account. Others counter that absence of documented exposure is not evidence of absence. Ancient people found bones constantly, interpreted them constantly, and rarely wrote down the moment of discovery in ways that survived. The fossils are real. The caves are real. The skulls are anatomically striking in precisely the way the hypothesis requires. Whether the myth grew from the bones or the bones were later recruited to confirm an existing myth is a question the current evidence cannot fully resolve. What can be said is that both explanations, the volcanic island reading and the fossil skull reading, point toward the same underlying truth about what the Polyphemus episode encodes. It encodes the danger of an island that does not behave like a place where people live, cliffs that collapse without warning, caves that seal themselves, a landscape that is visually dramatic, geologically unstable, and scattered with the remains of creatures that have no place in any familiar bestiarium. A coast, in other words, that announces its alienness through every available signal, and that a careful sailor should read as hostile territory before setting foot on it. The crew of Odysseus did not read those signals. They went ashore. They found the cave. They went inside. The boulder rolled across the entrance before they could process what that meant. That is not a supernatural event. That is a harbour you entered without scouting, on an island you didn't properly survey, in a geological environment where the rules of stable ground do not apply. The Cyclops has one eye in the poem. What it has in practice is the accumulated danger of everything a volcanic coastline can do to sailors who treat it as if it were somewhere ordinary, and the bones of creatures that proved, to anyone who found them and tried to understand them, that this island had always been host to things that did not fit the known world. They escaped the island. That matters. The crew blinded the Cyclops, slipped out beneath the bellies of his sheep, rowed hard for open water, and reached their ships. The volcanic coast fell behind them. For a few hours, or perhaps longer, the voyage felt salvageable again. They had their ships, they had the sea, they were moving. That is the exact psychological setup for what Homer does next, and it is devastatingly precise. After the Cyclops, Odysseus and his fleet sailed to the floating island of Aeolia, ruled by Aeolus, the keeper of winds. Aeolus receives them generously. A month of hospitality, feasting, stories, the kind of welcome that allows exhausted sailors to believe the worst is behind them. When the fleet finally departs, Aeolus gives Odysseus a gift, a leather bag, its mouth bound with silver wire, containing every wind except the gentle west that will carry the ships home. Odysseus keeps the bag himself, holds it, does not sleep for 9 days as his fleet draws closer and closer to Ithaca. On the 10th day, with home finally visible, smoke from hearth fires rising from the coast, the specific contour of a coastline he knows, exhaustion takes him. He sleeps. The crew, who have spent 9 days watching him guard that bag and quietly convincing themselves it holds treasure withheld from them, open it. Every wind Aeolus had imprisoned erupts simultaneously. The ships are blown off course immediately, violently, completely. In hours, days of careful sailing are erased. The fleet is driven back across the sea, all the way to Aeolia, and when Odysseus returns to ask Aeolus for help a second time, the Keeper of Winds sends him away. A man whose own crew has undone him so close to salvation is clearly cursed by the gods, and no gift of weather can fix that. This is, on the mythological surface, a story about curiosity and mistrust and the cruelty of fortune. But under that surface it is something every Mediterranean sailor would have recognized with a cold and specific dread, because the bag of winds is a nearly literal description of what Mediterranean weather can do, and of exactly how quickly a voyage in good standing can become catastrophic. The Mediterranean does not give its winds with warning. The sirocco, a hot dry wind that originates over North Africa and drives north across open water, can reach hurricane-force speeds of up to 100 kilometers per hour and develop within half a day. It arrives in clear weather or behind a wall of dust, and once it is running, it runs for days. The Odyssean winds, known today as the meltemi, blow from the north across the Aegean between May and September, appear suddenly in otherwise fine conditions, and can sustain both at force 7 or 8. Enough to push a vessel miles off its intended track within hours, enough to make sail handling a matter of pure physical survival rather than navigation. Ancient sailors did not choose between winds. They endured them, managed them, or were destroyed by them. The bag that Aeolus seals is a sailor's fantasy of control over something that was never controllable, and the moment the bag opens is the moment that fantasy collapses. Archaic Greek vessels were not well suited to resilience against sudden wind shifts. The standard rig was a single large rectangular sail controlled by 4 primary lines. The leather epictonos that served as a halyard, the hyperae managing the sail's upper edge, the podes controlling the lower sheets, and the kakloi, the reefing lines. The leather epictonos had one critical advantage. Its natural elasticity allowed it to absorb the sudden stress of a gust without transmitting the full load to the mast. That elasticity was not a luxury. It was the difference between a mast that bent and recovered and a mast that snapped. But elasticity only buys time. It does not solve the problem of a wind that has just changed direction by 45 degrees and is increasing in strength. Reefing on these vessels worked in the reverse of modern practice. Rather than lowering the sail, ancient sailors pulled its lower edge up toward the yard using the kakloi, reducing the sail's area from below while keeping the yard aloft. This was effective but physically demanding, and it required the full attention of a coordinated crew working in concert across the deck. At the same time, the helmsman, steering with quarter rudders, the pedalion, had to adjust course continuously to accommodate the changing wind angle, while the men at the sheets trimmed the sail's position to prevent it from being taken aback. In stable conditions with a reliable wind, this was manageable seamanship. In a sudden gust front with the wind shifting unpredictably and the sea building under the hull, it demanded everything simultaneously from every man aboard. A single lapse in coordination, one line released at the wrong moment, one rudder input that lagged behind a wind shift, could spin the vessel broadside and leave it exposed to the full force of whatever the sky had decided to do. What Homer encodes in the opening of the bag is precisely that lapse. It is not supernatural intervention that destroys Odysseus's homecoming. It is crew error at the worst possible moment. 9 days of careful, disciplined sailing brought them close enough to see the smoke of Ithaca. 9 days of the helmsman holding course, of the lines being tended, of the wind being managed through constant vigilance. And then, one failure of judgment, one moment of inattention, one human weakness dressed up as curiosity, and the winds run free. The terror the myth is encoding is the terror that every experienced sailor carries in some form, that a voyage's success is never secure until the anchor is down in a familiar harbour, that days of accumulated progress can be erased in minutes by a single bad decision, and that the sea does not distinguish between the careful and the careless once the wind has found its opening. The sirocco does not care that you are 9 hours from home. The meltemi does not negotiate. When the weather turns, it turns completely, and all the distance you built over 9 careful days becomes irrelevant. Odysseus, sleeping on the deck while Ithaca's smoke drifts toward him on the same favourable west wind that has been carrying them home, is the image of a man who has held on just slightly too long, trusted just slightly too much in a continuity that the sea was never obligated to maintain. His crew, fumbling with the silver wire on a bag they do not understand, are the image of every moment in sailing history when human error met atmospheric violence and the combination went badly. The bag opens, the winds come out, the coast disappears. That is not mythology. That is a weather event, and the sailors who first heard this story understood it as both. The winds drove them back, all of it. 9 days of progress, the smoke of Ithaca, the near certainty of home erased. And then, after the humiliation of returning to Aeolia and being turned away, the fleet sails on. 12 ships, still 12 ships. That number matters because of what is coming. Homer calls the place Telepilos, the Laestrygonian harbour, and the description he gives of it is so precise, so architecturally specific, that it reads less like invented geography and more like a navigator's warning transcribed into verse. The harbour is enclosed. Steep cliffs rise on either side of a narrow entrance, and once through that entrance the water opens into a calm, sheltered interior, the kind of inlet that looks, from a ship's perspective, like salvation. No swell, no chop. Calm water, easy anchorage, cliffs that block the wind. 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships enter and moor in the interior, close together, the way ships do when the water is calm and there is no reason to spread out. Odysseus alone ties his ship to a rock at the outer entrance, outside the bottleneck for reasons Homer never fully explains. A precaution, perhaps, or instinct, or the kind of unconscious seamanship that separates the experienced from the merely capable. Then the Laestrygonians appear on the cliff tops. They are giants in the poem, enormous, savage, beyond human scale, and they begin to throw rocks, not with supernatural precision, not with divine intervention, just rocks, from height, into a harbour full of densely packed ships that have nowhere to go. 11 ships. Gone. Every vessel in the interior is struck, staved, sunk, or dragged to shore and eaten. Only Odysseus, moored outside, cuts his line and rows desperately for open water. He escapes. He watches his fleet die behind him as he pulls for the sea. Of the 300 or so men who entered that harbour, he leaves with 1 ship's worth of survivors. It is, in terms of sheer loss, the single worst disaster in the entire Odyssey, and it is also, if you strip away the mythology, the most practically legible catastrophe in the poem. Because what Homer describes is not a monster story. It is a tactical disaster rooted in the specific geometry of an enclosed harbour, and the ancient Mediterranean was full of harbours exactly like the one he is describing. Consider what archaeologists found at Phalasana, on the western coast of Crete. A closed, fortified harbour, accessible through a single artificial channel, narrow enough that it could be physically sealed with a chain. Ringed by massive walls and towers, a single entrance that was, in every meaningful tactical sense, a trap with a door. Phalasana was a documented pirate stronghold, and its design was not accidental. The geometry of the place was the weapon. Ships that entered came in through a bottleneck and found themselves in an enclosed space with nowhere to manoeuvre. Rome understood this so well that when they finally moved to suppress the piracy operating out of Phalasana in 69 to 67 BC, the solution was not a naval battle inside the harbour. It was a masonry barrier across the entrance, sealing the port permanently, because the Romans recognized that the harbour itself, that specific shape, that particular relationship between entrance and interior, was what made it dangerous. The Laestrygonians may be giants in Homer's telling, but the communities they represent are not hard to identify. Hostile coastal peoples, pirate enclaves, raiders who controlled a choke point harbour and understood exactly how to use its geography against incoming ships. You lure vessels in with the promise of calm water. You wait until they are moored close together in the interior, their crews relaxed, their ships clustered and immobile. And then you control the entrance and the heights, and the ships that came in looking for shelter cannot get out. But there is a second reading that sits alongside the human violence, and it is equally deadly. Ancient Periplus accounts, the practical navigation guides that real sailors carried, contain explicit warnings about what they called rock-filled harbours, inlets where hidden shoals and sharp submerged stones could rip anchors from the seabed and shred a hull on entry or exit. Harbours where the chart, if there was one, was unreliable, where the calm interior surface gave no indication of what the bottom looked like. A ship that entered such a place in good faith and then tried to leave in a hurry, rowers working hard, the vessel moving faster than careful inspection of the water could accommodate, might discover the rocks only when the hull was already opening. This is not a hypothetical danger. It is the kind of danger that went into the Periplus precisely because it had already killed people, and it maps onto the Laestrygonian harbour in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Rocks from above, rocks from below. Whether the threat is human or geological, the mechanism is the same. A narrow entrance, a crowded interior, and no room to move. Ancient Greek galleys were not forgiving vessels in confined water. A standard warship or merchant galley of the archaic period ran 30 to 35 metres in length, and manoeuvring such a vessel in a cramped single-gate bay required either exceptional seamanship or tugboats, the ancient equivalent of harbour pilots guiding ships into position because the ships themselves could not easily turn in their own length. Entering an unknown harbour was already a calculated risk. Entering one with your full fleet, mooring close together, and losing situational awareness of the entrance behind you was not a mistake. It was a sequence of small, reasonable decisions that produced a catastrophic outcome. Each step made sense in isolation. The whole sequence was lethal. What makes the Laestrygonian episode so specifically useful as a maritime lesson is that it merges two distinct dangers into one. Human violence and coastal geography are not separate threats in this story. They are the same threat, expressed through the shape of the land. The cliffs that make the harbour calm are the same cliffs from which rocks are thrown. The narrow entrance that keeps out the swell is the same narrow entrance that prevents escape. The sheltered interior that invites close mooring is the same interior that turns 11 ships into a killing ground. Homer does not distinguish between the hostility of the people and the hostility of the place, because from a sailor's perspective, they are not meaningfully different. A harbour that traps you will kill you, whether it is pirates or reefs that do the killing. Odysseus survives because he did not enter all the way. He stayed at the mouth. He kept open water behind him. That single choice, the instinct, the experience, or the luck to remain outside the trap, is the entire lesson of the episode encoded in a single image, and it is the kind of lesson that does not require giants. It requires only a harbour with one entrance, and a fleet that forgot what it meant to need a way out. One ship escapes, 11 do not. The sea falls quiet again, and Odysseus rows. One ship, one crew, rowing south along a coastline that has just swallowed a fleet. Homer places the Sirens somewhere in the stretch of open water below the Italian coast, and the detail that often gets lost in the romance of the episode is how the encounter actually begins. Not with music drifting sweetly across calm water. With Circe's warning. With explicit practical navigation intelligence about a specific stretch of coast, where ships have wrecked not because the sea was violent, but because the crew became incapable of doing their jobs at exactly the moment when their jobs required everything they had. That detail repays attention. The Sirens do not sink ships with storms or currents or reefs directly. They disable the crew's decision-making. They occupy the mind at the worst possible moment, and in a poem that encodes real maritime hazards, that description is not decoration. It is the hazard. So what were the Sirens before myth polished them into irresistible singers? The Ligali Islands sit off the Amalfi coast, a few kilometres south of the Sorrentine Peninsula. 3 small islands, the largest, La Rotonda, and a second significant rock called Castelluccio, that have carried the name Le Sirens, the Siren Islands, for as far back as the record goes. Local tradition is insistent. This is where the Sirens were, and in the late 20th century, acoustic researchers decided to take that tradition seriously enough to test it. The field tests conducted at Ligali, led by bioacoustician Karl-Heinz Frommelt, produced results that were genuinely unexpected. The 2 principal rocks at the site function as natural acoustic reflectors. Sound generated between them does not simply dissipate across the water in the normal way. It bounces back, concentrates, and under the right conditions creates measurable amplification at distances that would otherwise be far beyond the range of the original source. A loudspeaker placed at the site produced a signal that was measurably louder at 400 meters when the equipment was positioned between the rocks than it was at 200 to 300 meters. A reversal of the normal pattern of sound decay over water that the island geometry alone could explain. But the loudspeaker, simulating a human voice, was not powerful enough to generate the full effect. The vocalization that reproduced the acoustic profile most accurately was a Mediterranean monk seal. Monachus monachus, the monk seal, is now critically endangered and rarely seen in populated coastal waters. 2,000 years ago it was common throughout the Mediterranean, breeding on rocky shorelines, hauling out in coastal caves, present in exactly the kind of remote island geography that defines Ligali. Monk seals produce calls of low frequency and high amplitude, powerful enough to travel far over open water, well beyond anything a human voice can generate without amplification. When Frommelt's team modelled the seal vocalizations against the Ligali acoustic environment, the match was substantially stronger than with human or wind-produced sound. A monk seal calling from within that island cluster, heard by a crew rowing past at some distance, would have produced a sound both strange and compelling, not easily identifiable as animal, not easily dismissed. This is the hypothesis. It is supported by experimental data, and it is not without elegance. An eerie, amplified call emanating from rocks close to a hazardous stretch of coast, drawing crew attention away from the water ahead. That is a mechanism that does not require magic to be lethal. It also does not require certainty. The researchers themselves were explicit on this point. The Ligali acoustic tests did not rule out other origins. Geophonic sources, wind moving through rock formations, wave resonance in coastal caves, can produce sounds that are deeply unsettling to anyone hearing them without context. Bird calls are another possibility, and here the mythology offers an interesting note. Homer describes the Sirens as possessing an irresistible voice, but the earliest Greek visual art portrays them not as mermaids, but as women with the bodies of birds, part human, part avian, existing at the boundary between the familiar and the strange. That iconography predates the fish-tailed image by centuries. If the original observers of this coastline were associating the sound with something bird-like rather than human, the bird call hypothesis and the visual tradition start to point in the same direction. What the competing explanations share is more important than what divides them. Whether the source was monk seals, wind acoustics, coastal birds, or some combination of all three, what each theory describes is the same functional hazard, an anomalous sound attached to a specific piece of dangerous coastline that could command disproportionate attention from a crew at sea. Navigation in ancient Greece required sustained, distributed awareness. Reading currents, watching the surface ahead for colour changes that indicated depth, tracking the wind for signs of weather coming behind you, maintaining the stroke rate, monitoring the coastline for landmarks. All of these things had to happen simultaneously, and none of them were forgiving of interruption. A navigator who turned his attention to something unexpected on the water for 60 seconds while approaching a reef was not guaranteed 60 seconds to recover. Ancient Mediterranean sailing was precision work, done on an unsteady platform with incomplete information, and the penalty for losing focus near the coast could be almost instantaneous. Against that background, the Sirens episode reads with uncomfortable clarity, a sound that is hard to identify, that does not obviously resolve into something known and dismissible, that compels attention precisely because it refuses to be categorized. That is not just a pleasant distraction. It is a sensory intrusion that colonizes the cognitive resources a crew needs for navigation. The story does not say the Sirens attacked ships. It says ships drove themselves onto the rocks while their crews listened, the meadow full of bones surrounding the Siren shore. The physical evidence of the thing Homer wants you to understand before the song even starts. This is a coast where ships have already died, and the mechanism of their death was not violence. It was attention failure. Odysseus, following Circe's advice, has his crew fill their ears with wax and has himself tied to the mast. He gets to hear whatever is there to hear. He survives. And in the logic of the myth functioning as navigational instruction, the episode is not fundamentally about desire or temptation, or the weakness of human will. It is about the management of sensory distraction near dangerous water, and the discipline of keeping a crew operational when something on the coast is trying to unmake their focus. Sing or call or echo off the rocks, the Siren's voice only needed to work once. The bones on the shore are the operational record. The ship passes, the sound falls behind, and ahead, closer now, the water begins to narrow. The narrowing is not subtle. Anyone who has sailed the Strait of Messina for the first time understands this in the body before the mind processes it. The walls are coming in, the water is accelerating, and on the Calabrian side there is a headland that does not look like it intends to negotiate. That headland is Scylla. The modern town clings to its slopes, whitewashed houses stacked against limestone that rises roughly 73 metres above the waterline. From a low freeboard ancient vessel, a galley sitting perhaps a metre above the surface at the oarports, that cliff does not merely rise, it overhangs the imagination. It is the kind of geological feature that fills the visual field so completely that you are aware of almost nothing else, which is precisely the problem, because while you're watching the cliff, the water beneath your hull is moving it up to 4.5 knots toward it. Ancient sailors did not have that figure in knots, but they had the feel of it in their hands and under their oars. The Strait of Messina contains some of the strongest tidal currents in the entire Mediterranean basin. In the central zone, surface flows regularly approach 4 to 4.5 knots, fast enough to defeat the progress of an oared vessel working against it, fast enough to carry a drifting ship broadside into the cliff face before anyone on board has fully registered what is happening. The channel between Scylla and the Sicilian coast compresses to approximately 3.5 kilometres at its narrowest. In a modern sailing vessel, with an engine on standby, that is a manageable problem. In a Bronze Age or archaic merchant ship without the ability to tack effectively into a current, with a crew already exhausted from the passage around the island's southern coast, it is a corridor that actively selects for catastrophe. Homer gives Scylla 6 heads, each head on a long serpentine neck, each equipped with 3 rows of teeth, and at the moment the ship passes, the heads strike the water simultaneously, seizing 1 sailor per head. 6 men taken in a single coordinated attack. The crew cannot fight back. They cannot outrun it. They can only keep rowing while their shipmates are eaten. This is not arbitrary horror. It is remarkably precise description of what cliffside impact in a narrow, current-driven channel actually looks like from the survivor's perspective. Consider the mechanics. A vessel pushed by a 4-knot current toward a 73-metre rock face does not gently make contact. The surf that builds against that kind of vertical limestone sends spray and broken water back across the surface in every direction. The hull, if it reaches the cliff, does not bounce. It splinters, and in the process of splintering it throws crew members against stone into the sea under the ship's own structure as it collapses inward. Men can be lost within seconds of first contact, without warning, without any sequence of events that gives anyone time to intervene. From the perspective of those surviving at the oars, it would look almost exactly as Homer describes. Specific crew members simply gone, taken at a speed that the human mind cannot track or comprehend. Not killed visibly, taken. The sound of that cliff is part of the experience as much as the sight of it. Waves striking a sheer vertical wall do not simply crash and subside, they echo. The limestone reflects sound with extraordinary efficiency, sending the noise of the sea back at itself from multiple angles, layering impact over impact, so that the roar you hear is never just the wave directly in front of you. It is every wave that has struck that face in the last several seconds, all arriving at your ears simultaneously from different directions. Combined with the spray that reduces visibility near the base of the cliff, and the compression of the channel that makes every sound louder by proximity, the acoustic environment at the Scythian headland is genuinely disorienting. Ancient writers, including Polybius and Strabo, described the rock as producing dangerous surf and a kind of snatching violence, words that belong to lived experience, not poetic convention. Ancient sailors naming that experience needed a form that could carry the warning efficiently. A monster with multiple heads, striking simultaneously, taking men faster than any human action can respond. That is not mythology indulging itself. That is a mnemonic device engineered to encode a navigational hazard in terms vivid enough to survive centuries of oral transmission without losing its operational core. You hear about Scylla, and you know, before you've ever entered the strait, that the danger is rapid, multiple, and beyond individual countermeasure. You know that the loss will be specific, not the whole ship, not a storm-driven sinking, but men seized from a vessel that continues to sail. You know the mechanism is proximity to the cliff, not the open water. The story tells you where, how many, and how fast. Everything a pilot warning needs to contain. There is something additionally important about the way Scylla works in the poem, something that separates it from the dangers that have come before. The Sirens could be evaded by procedure. Stop up the ears, tie the captain to the mast to maintain heading. Aeolus's winds could be contained, at least in theory, in a bag. But Scylla presents a hazard that procedure cannot eliminate. You can see the cliff. You know it is there. You know what it will do if you get close enough, and yet the current and the channel geometry mean that hugging it may still be your best option, because the alternative, Charybdis on the other side, is capable of destroying the entire ship at once. Scylla is the hazard you choose deliberately because the other hazard is worse. She is visible, specific, partially calculable, and nonetheless inevitable in certain conditions. That is the nautical truth at the centre of the myth. The most terrifying hazard the sea can present is not the one that is hidden or unpredictable. It is the one you can see clearly, approach with full knowledge, and still not avoid paying a price to pass. The Scythian cliff is not a surprise. The current that carries you toward it is not a surprise. The loss of crew when contact happens is not a surprise. And the fact that none of this knowledge prevents the loss is exactly what made this headland worth personifying as a six-headed monster that cannot be killed, cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be outrun. You pass by Scylla the way you pass by any hazard that charges a toll for safe passage. By accepting that the toll will be paid, keeping the ship moving, and not letting the men who are taken stop the oars of the men who survive. The cliff roars behind you. The echo takes a moment to die, and when it does, you realize the water ahead is doing something that cliffs cannot do. It is breathing. That breathing is not a metaphor. It is tidal exchange, and it happens on a schedule. And ancient sailors who understood the strait understood that Charybdis was not a creature of ambush, but a creature of rhythm, which made it in certain ways more frightening than the cliff. The Strait of Messina is a hydraulic system. It connects the Tyrrhenian Sea to the north and the Ionian Sea to the south, and those two bodies of water do not share the same tidal phase. They rise and fall at different times, which means that the strait, narrowing to just over 3 kilometers at its throat, is under constant pressure to equalize a difference that never fully equalizes. Water moves through the channel the way breath moves through a compressed pipe, fast, with force, and in alternating directions. The current reverses roughly every 6 hours, cycling through 4 distinct phases per day. During spring tides, the north-going flow, known to local sailors as the Montanet, pushes through the narrower section at 4 to 5 knots. That is not a river current. That is a directed force capable of overwhelming the forward progress of a vessel whose crew is rowing hard. Where that force encounters the opposite flow, where north-going water collides with south-going water, where Tyrrhenian density meets Ionian salinity, where temperature layers from different depths shear against each other at the surface, the water does not simply mix. It organizes itself into violence, eddies form and collapse. The surface goes slick in patches, flattened by subsurface rotation that pulls downward rather than forward. And in the zone approximately 200 meters off Torre Faro, on the Sicilian side of the narrowest point, a periodic whirlpool forms with enough rotational force to take a small vessel off its heading entirely, spinning it broadside into the current before the crew can respond. This is the whirlpool that ancient sources called Charybdis. It sits there now, measurable, predictable within the tidal cycle, listed in modern sailing guides with recommended transit windows and current timing as practical navigational cautions. A 2017 study in the Journal of Navigation Modelling Collision Risk in the Strait identified it as one of the most densely trafficked and consistently hazardous sea areas in the entire Mediterranean, not as history, but as a present operational fact for modern vessels equipped with engines, radar, and tide tables. When modern maritime engineers flag a passage as dangerous, the case for its ancient lethality requires no further argument. For an ancient ship, the calculus was catastrophic. A low freeboard oared galley sitting perhaps a metre above the waterline had almost no lateral resistance. When a rotating current catches a hull like that, it does not push the vessel, it rotates the vessel around a centre point that is not the ship's centre of gravity. The stern goes one direction, the bow goes another, and suddenly the ship is no longer making progress through the strait, but describing an arc around a point of maximum downward pull. Once that rotation begins, oars become nearly useless. Rowing against a whirlpool from the inside is like trying to walk up the wall of a bowl. The geometry is wrong. The leverage is wrong. Everything the crew does to correct heading accelerates the problem, because every stroke taken on the high side drives the low side deeper into the rotation. Homer describes Charybdis as swallowing the sea 3 times a day and vomiting it back up. He describes the seabed becoming briefly visible during the drawdown, the surrounding water boiling with the chaos of the return surge, the sound enormous enough to be heard at a distance. These are observational details, not literary invention. A rotating, periodically reversing current in a narrow channel creates exactly that pattern. The drawing in phase, when surface water feeds the rotation and the centre dips, and the release phase, when the organised rotation collapses and the water drives outward in all directions at once, generating a surface eruption of white water and spray that could look, from a passing vessel's deck, very much like something enormous and alive expelling what it had consumed. The periodic quality of Charybdis is what separates it most clearly from Scylla, and what made it a different kind of terror. The cliff was always there. A sailor who had been through the strait knew exactly where the rock was, and while the current that pushed toward it varied in intensity, the cliff itself did not move and did not rest. Charybdis was cyclical. It was dormant when the tidal phase was transitional, then lethal when the exchange was at full force. A captain who entered the strait at the wrong point in the tidal cycle would find an ordinary-looking stretch of water ahead, slick-surfaced perhaps with a few odd eddies at the margin, and then, without warning, the rotation would take him. The danger was invisible at the moment it was most dangerous, and visible only when the violence was already complete. This is the opposition that Homer understood structurally, even if he expressed it in serpent necks and sucking mouths. Scylla was the visible hazard on the fixed side. Charybdis was the invisible, cyclical hazard on the open side. They defined the corridor between them. The cliff told you where not to go on one axis. The whirlpool told you where not to go on the other. The safe passage, such as it existed, was a moving target defined by current phase, wind direction, tidal timing, and the handling characteristics of whatever ship you happened to be sailing. Miss any of those variables and the corridor closed. Ancient pilots who work the strait regularly would have accumulated this knowledge over years of passage making, and what they knew would have been worth transmitting carefully, because the consequences of getting it wrong were not recoverable. There was no anchoring in a 4-knot current at the narrowest point. There was no heaving to and waiting out the bad conditions in a channel 3 kilometres wide with steep shorelines on both sides. Once you were in the strait, you were committed to the transit, and the transit was timed or it was not survivable. The myth encodes this operational reality with almost bureaucratic precision. Circe, the divine navigator figure who advises Odysseus before the passage, does not tell him to avoid the strait. She tells him when to pass, which side to favour, what to watch for, and what price to accept. She describes Charybdis as the threat that destroys the ship entirely versus Scylla as the threat that takes only some of the crew. This is not a moral hierarchy. It is a risk assessment. The whirlpool is a whole ship loss. The cliff is a recoverable loss if you keep moving. That calculation, hold the middle, accept partial loss, maintain forward motion, time the tidal window, is exactly the calculation modern sailing guides recommend for transiting the Strait of Messina at Torrefero. Allow for the current. Know the cycle. Favour the eastern side when the Montagnette is running strong. Do not stop. 3,000 years of different ships, different charts, different instruments, the same advice. Because the water is still there, and it is still breathing, and it has not once stopped running its cycle since the first Greek sailor put a name to what it felt like to fall into its centre and not come back out. So the knowledge existed. Circe delivered it plainly. Keep moving. Favour the cliffside. Accept the loss of a few men rather than the loss of everything. And Odysseus, who had survived the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, and the bag of winds through a combination of cunning and catastrophic luck, found himself unable to act on that knowledge cleanly. He wanted a third option. He asked Circe whether he could fight Scylla directly, position his spearmen at the rail, hold the cliff at a distance, refuse to let the monster simply take 6 of his crew without resistance. Circe told him no. There was no third option. That was the entire point of the passage. This is the moment the Odyssey stops being an adventure story and becomes something closer to a professional manual, encoded in the only language ancient audiences had for technical maritime instruction: myth. The forced choice between Scylla and Charybdis was not a moral test dressed in monster clothing. It was a seamanship dilemma with a specific measurable geometry. The Strait of Messina narrows to roughly 3 kilometres at its tightest point. On the Calabrian side, the cliff at Scylla drops almost vertically to the waterline. On the Sicilian side, the periodic whirlpool forms in the tidal zone near Torrefaro, where the hydraulic exchange between the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas generates rotational forces strong enough to overwhelm a vessel with no engine and limited steering authority. Between those two hazards, a ship transiting at peak tidal exchange had perhaps 2.5 kilometres to work with, and a current running at 4 to 5 knots pushing it broadside toward one shore or the other. An ancient Greek trireme could sustain about 6 knots under steady rowing and sprint briefly to 8. Its turning radius was approximately 90 metres, roughly 2.5 ship lengths, which sounds adequate until you remember that in a 4-knot lateral current, every heading correction you make is being partially undone by the water moving beneath your keel. The ship responds to the oars, but the oars are working against a medium that is itself in motion. Your effective manoeuvring margin in practical terms was far smaller than the chart suggested. The corridor was narrower than the numbers implied. In that geometry, a captain had exactly 2 decisions to make, and no time to reconsider either. First, which side do you favour? Second, how close do you go? The cliff was predictable. The whirlpool was cyclical. A competent pilot who knew the tidal phase could time the transit to catch the window when Charybdis was transitional rather than active. But even a well-timed transit left a ship fighting current, and a ship fighting current drifts toward the nearest obstruction. Favour the Scylla side too strongly, and you put your outboard oarsmen within reach of the cliff face. Favour the Charybdis side to avoid the cliff, and you risk entering the rotation when the phase tips. Circe's advice resolved this binary not by finding a middle path. There was no stable middle path, but by ranking the outcomes. Total ship loss versus partial crew loss. A whirlpool that takes the vessel whole versus a cliff that takes 6 men and releases the rest. That ranking is not poetry. It is triage, applied to a vessel at sea under conditions of extreme constraint, and it reflects a kind of command logic that any navigator who has ever had to choose between 2 bad options will recognize immediately. The burden Odysseus carried through the Narrows was the burden every ship captain carries when geography closes off all the good choices and leaves only a spectrum of bad ones. He knew men would die. He knew which men. Homer is unsparing here, describing them by name, describing their arms reaching toward the ship as Scylla lifted them clear of the rail. He kept the ship moving. He didn't stop to fight. He didn't attempt to split the difference and sail a hypothetical centre line that the current would not permit. He accepted the partial loss and held the heading, because the alternative was accepting the total loss, and that was not a trade any captain with 6 surviving crew members could rationally take. This is catastrophe triage at sea, and the Odyssey preserves it in precise operational terms. The constraint is geographic, the binary is real. The correct answer exists, but the correct answer requires surrendering men you are responsible for, watching them die at close range, and continuing to function as the decision-maker while that happens. The monster in this reading is not Scylla specifically. The monster is the position itself, the command burden of having to choose the loss you can survive rather than the loss you cannot, and then living afterward in the knowledge that you made the choice deliberately. What makes this episode remarkable as a piece of preserved maritime wisdom is that it does not pretend the correct choice is comfortable. Odysseus makes the right decision by Circe's strategic assessment and loses 6 men anyway. The myth does not reward him with a clean passage. It simply confirms that the alternative would have been worse. That distinction between a decision being correct and a decision being painless is exactly what experienced navigators learn and what inexperienced ones often refuse to accept until geography teaches them personally. The episode also encodes a broader principle about risk management under extreme constraint, that the value of advanced knowledge is not that it eliminates danger, but that it shifts the nature of your loss from catastrophic to bounded. Circe's briefing gave Odysseus a framework for anticipating what the strait would demand. He entered the Narrows knowing the shape of the loss that was coming. He could not prevent it. He could only move through it at speed, maintain forward motion, and refuse to compound the partial loss by stopping in a place where stopping meant everything. Modern sailing guides for the Strait of Messina recommend essentially the same posture. Know the tidal phase before you enter. Choose your transit window accordingly. Commit to the passage. Do not attempt to hold position in the channel if conditions turn. Accept that the strait will take something from you in the form of fuel, time, or unplanned course deviation, and keep the ship moving toward the open water on the other side. The Odyssey's version replaces tidal tables with divine instruction, and replaces fuel consumption with human lives. But the underlying logic is unchanged. You enter knowing the cost, you hold the heading, you come out the other side carrying what the strait allowed you to keep. Geography does not negotiate. It offers a corridor, it sets the terms, and it collects what it decides to collect. The only command decision that matters is whether you understood the terms before you entered, and whether you had the discipline to accept them, rather than spend the transit searching for a third option that the strait never offered and was never going to offer. Circe knew. The myth knew. And every pilot who has read the strait's current tables before transiting Torrefero has arrived, by a different route, at exactly the same conclusion. The strait released them, the cliff receded, the whirlpool fell behind, and for a ship that had just run the gauntlet between Scylla and Charybdis, open water must have felt like freedom, the relief of space, of distance from stone, of horizon in every direction instead of channel walls closing in. But the open Mediterranean had its own category of terror, and it did not announce itself with cliffs or rotational currents. It announced itself with a sound like forced air through an enormous pipe, followed by a column of spray rising 4 to 6 meters above the surface, followed by the emergence of something so large it took the whole width of the horizon to contain. The ancient Greeks had a word for whatever that thing was. They called it a ketos, in Latin, cetus. The term was not taxonomically precise. It functioned as a catch-all label for any creature of the sea that was simply too large to be approached, too strange to be classified, too powerful to be contested. Ancient art depicted the ketos as a colossal beast, sometimes serpentine, sometimes finned, always ship-sized, with a massive skull and a body that dwarfed whatever vessel had the misfortune to encounter it. The creature appeared in vase paintings, in temple reliefs, in the myth of Perseus and Andromeda, and in the navigational anxiety of every sailor who ever lost sight of land. It was the deep water's contribution to the same logic that had produced Scylla and Charybdis. Give the unknown a shape, give the shape a name, and at least you're no longer afraid of something with no form at all. What was the ketos, in biological terms? The Mediterranean answer is not as exotic as the mythology implies. The fin whale reaches between 18 and 25 meters in length and weighs up to 70 metric tons. The minke whale, smaller but still formidable, runs 7 to 11 meters. Both species have moved through Mediterranean waters since antiquity. Both are rorquals, baleen whales equipped with 2 blowholes that can project a vapour column 4 to 6 meters into the air. From a small open vessel riding low in the water, that spout would appear to materialize out of nowhere, a sudden vertical eruption at close range, followed by the surfacing of a body that from waterline perspective seemed as long as the ship itself and far more massive. The ancient Greek sailor had no reference point for this, no telescopic aid, no prior knowledge of cetacean biology, no category into which a living thing of that size could be placed except the category of monster. the 5th century BC Admiral Nearchus, sailing the Indian Ocean fleet of Alexander the Great, recorded exactly this experience. His sailors encountered whales and were overwhelmed. The spouts appeared like waterspouts or geysers, the bodies surfaced without warning at ship-beam distance, and the size, that unprocessable, irrational size, filled trained naval crews with awe that bordered on paralysis. Nearchus had to order his ships to beat drums and blow horns to drive the creatures off, not because the whales were attacking, but because the sailors could not function while something that large was that close. If this was the reaction of a disciplined military fleet operating under direct command, consider what the sight did to a smaller merchant crew navigating alone in open water, without a commander experienced enough to rationalize the encounter. The feeding behavior amplified the effect further. When a fin whale lunge feeds, it accelerates to roughly 11 kilometers per hour and opens its jaw wide enough to engulf up to 70 cubic meters of water in a single gulp. It then expels that water through its baleen plates in a sustained frothy surge, a white, churning discharge visible at significant distance that early observers described as a creature spewing waves from its mouth. From a vessel watching this at a bleak angle, partially obscured by swell and sea haze, the interpretation was not a large animal filtering krill. The interpretation was something consuming the ocean itself, something that generated its own weather, something operating at a scale that placed it outside the category of prey and inside the category of catastrophe. Distance and poor visibility are the crucial variables here. The Mediterranean is not always the clear, bright sea of tourist imagination. Afternoon haze, sea smoke in colder months, low sun angles at dawn and dusk, and simple scale distortion at open water distances all conspire to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. A whale surfacing 800 meters from a vessel in morning haze is not a recognizable animal. It is dark mass emerging from formless grey, exhaling vapour, rolling a body of uncertain length just below the surface before submerging again with a slow, deliberate power that suggests complete indifference to the ship's existence. That indifference, creature's absolute lack of reaction to human presence, may have been as disturbing as its size. Monsters in the ancient imagination at least registered you. The whale simply continued existing on its own enormous terms. This is how the Ketos was born, and this is why the tradition persisted across cultures far beyond Greece. Phoenician sailors, Roman naval commanders, Arab navigators, and medieval European cartographers all independently arrived at the same archetype, a sea beast of impossible scale encountered in open water that rendered human vessels insignificant. The specific anatomical details varied: the number of fins, the presence or absence of legs, the character of the mouth. But the core encounter was consistent because the core phenomenon was consistent. Large whales exist. Large whales surface unexpectedly. Large whales engage in behaviours that, observed without context by mariners in small vessels, produce exactly the kind of visceral terror that mythology requires to function as a warning system. And the warning encoded in the Ketos tradition was real, even if the biology was distorted. Open water was not safe simply because it had no cliffs and no narrows. It had creatures of genuinely extraordinary scale, capable of capsizing a vessel through contact, capable of surfacing beneath a hull and lifting it, capable of simply being present in a way that destabilized crew confidence at exactly the moment when confidence was the only thing keeping a ship navigating efficiently. The myth did not need to invent supernatural anatomy to make that hazard meaningful. The hazard was already there. The mythology just gave it a face that the culture could process, paint on a vase, include in an epic, and pass from one generation of sailors to the next as part of the accumulated knowledge base of what the sea contained. The Ketos stands in the Odyssey's world alongside Scylla, Charybdis, and the Sirens as the open water counterpart to the channel-specific hazards. The reminder that once the strait was behind you, the deep water held its own scale of encounter. The monsters changed form depending on where you were. In the narrows they were geological, in the open sea they breathed. What made the Mediterranean so continuously dangerous was not that any one of its hazards was overwhelming in isolation. It was that they combined. A sailor navigating the Messina Strait in deteriorating weather was not contending with a whirlpool or a cliff face, or a gust front or the sound of something calling from the rocks. He was contending with all of them simultaneously, layered into a single sensory environment where the boundaries between creature, phenomenon, and catastrophe had completely dissolved. This is the feature of ancient maritime experience that tends to get lost when we analyse the Odyssey monster by monster, episode by episode. We isolate the Sirens and discuss their song. We isolate Scylla and count her heads. We isolate Charybdis and measure her rotational geometry. But the poem itself does not quite do this. Odysseus moves through these hazards in rapid sequence, and the sailors experiencing them would not have encountered them as cleanly separated events. They would have encountered them as an environment, a continuous, overwhelming, intention-filled environment in which everything seemed to be operating against them at once. Consider what that environment actually produced in terms of pure sound. Ancient mariners developed an extraordinarily sophisticated auditory vocabulary for reading the sea. The difference between sharp, choppy wave sounds and the deep, rolling boom of surf indicated the approach of land before it was visible. A sustained, low-frequency churning or growling in otherwise calm water warned of hidden reefs grinding beneath the surface. The sudden eruption of coastal bird calls after days of open water silence signalled cliffs or nesting headlands somewhere beyond the visible horizon. These were not poetic descriptions. These were navigational tools, the auditory equivalent of a chart, refined across generations of accumulated near disasters. Now compress all of those sounds into a single channel. The Messina Strait, where Scylla and Charybdis almost certainly originated, generates tidal currents of up to 5 knots and produces powerful, periodic eddies that amplify into full whirlpools. The rush of water through that narrow gap generates a low-frequency roar that the surrounding cliffs trap and reverberate. So the sound does not dissipate outward. It accumulates, bounces, grows. Add storm-driven wind funneled through the same channel, and the howl of compressed air mixes with wave roar into something that is acoustically unrecognizable as any individual element. Add the spray thrown by breaking water against cliff faces, and the air fills with salt mist that further dissolves visibility. Now add, somewhere in that same soundscape, the vocalization of a monk seal in one of the nearby sea caves. The Mediterranean monk seal, Monachus monachus, produces low-frequency moans that carry far farther than the human voice. Acoustic experiments conducted at the Lee Galley Islands, the twin rocks most commonly proposed as the Sirens' location, demonstrated that these rocks function as a natural amplifier, allowing seal calls to propagate several hundred meters offshore into open water. In ordinary conditions, on a calm day with no competing noise, a sailor might recognize this as an animal sound. But in the acoustic environment of a storm channel, where wind roar and wave crash and tidal surge are already occupying every available frequency, that seal moan arrives with its source completely obscured. It does not sound like a seal, it sounds like a voice with no body attached, emerging from rock and spray and howling air, calling from somewhere between the cliffs and the open sea. This is the precise condition that produced the Sirens, not a deliberate invention, not a metaphor consciously constructed, but a genuine perceptual event, the kind that happens when enough real phenomena overlap in a way that exceeds the observer's ability to parse them into separate categories. The sound was real. The danger was real. The interpretation as something with intent and voice was the only available framework for processing an experience that had no other name. Baleen whales contributed the same dynamic from the open water side. The spout of a fin whale, that 4 to 6 metre column of vapour, carries its own distinctive sound, a forced exhalation through twin blowholes that ancient writers described as a roaring or whooshing that preceded a cloud of screaming gulls gathering over the disturbance. The whale itself attracted birds. The birds generated noise. The noise preceded the whale's appearance. So the whole system, the gulls, the spray, the vapour column, the emerging bulk, arrived as a single auditory and visual event before any one component could be identified individually. The creature seemed to generate its own weather, to summon birds, to command the surface of the sea as it surfaced through it. The line between animal and storm condition was not blurred by careless observation. It was blurred because the phenomenon itself genuinely crossed that boundary. Ancient observers did not maintain the categorical separations between creature, omen, and environment that modern natural science imposes. This was not a failure of intellect. It was a reasonable response to genuinely ambiguous perceptual data. When the same acoustic environment contained a tidal roar, a seal moan, a whale spout, a storm howl, and the crack of surf against rock all simultaneously, asking which element was the hazard was not a useful question. The hazard was the total environment. Giving that environment a singular name, Scylla, Charybdis, the Sirens, was not mythological distortion. It was information compression. It reduced an enormously complex and lethal sensory field into a transmissible warning. This is why the Odyssey's monsters are most powerful precisely where biology and geography overlap. Scylla is strongest because she fuses a geological reality, the razor cliff of the Messina Channel, with an acoustic reality, the sounds of water and animal that the channel generates. Charybdis is strongest because a real whirlpool's roar and rhythm occupy the same perceptual space as a breathing, consuming creature. The Sirens are strongest because monk seal vocalizations and amplifying rocks together produce exactly the auditory hallucination the myth describes. In each case, the monster emerges not from pure imagination, but from the intersection of a specific place, with a specific biological presence and a specific set of weather and current conditions. Connect these episodes across the poem's geography, and you arrive at something more unified than a catalogue of separate supernatural encounters. You arrive at a coherent seafaring worldview, one in which the sea is not passive terrain, but an active, layered environment that uses every available channel, sound, creature, and current against you simultaneously. The poem holds together as more than a hero's adventure, because the hazards it encodes hold together as more than a list of obstacles. They are a single integrated system, and the sailors who survived long enough to transmit this knowledge understood it as such. The monsters were never entirely separate from the sea that surrounded them. They were expressions of it, concentrated, named, given voice and appetite and intention so that they could be taught, remembered, and feared in the specific ways that kept ships alive. Understanding how the sea kills is only half the equation. The other half is understanding how sailors lived, and Greek sailors, navigating one of the world's most geographically complex bodies of water, in open-hulled wooden vessels, developed a survival system of extraordinary precision. The foundation of that system was the periplus, the rudder. These were essentially annotated route descriptions, passed between captains and copied into sailing manuals, recording the distances between identifiable landmarks, the profiles of mountain ranges visible from offshore, the shape of harbour entrances, the colour of the water approaching a particular shoal. A Greek sailor did not navigate by abstract coordinates. He navigated by recognition, building a mental library of coastal silhouettes, promontory shapes, and anchorage characteristics so detailed that a known coastline could be read in darkness by its sound and smell before a single feature became visible. The mountain behind Ithaca, the particular cliff angle above the Sicilian coast, the way a certain headland channeled wind in a specific direction that told you exactly where you were without needing to see it. Seasonal timing was the next layer. Greek sailors marked the opening of the sailing season by the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, the point in late spring when that star cluster became visible just before dawn, a signal that the Etesian winds, the reliable summer breezes blowing from the northwest and southwest, had established themselves enough to make open water passages predictable. The disappearance of the Pleiades in autumn closed the season. Between those two markers, experienced sailors understood the wind regime in regional terms. Boreas drove cold northern air in winter, the Sirocco pushed warm, wet air from the south in spring, and the Etesians gave summer its navigable structure. Choosing when to leave was not impatience or caution. It was the most fundamental navigational decision a captain made, and getting it wrong meant arriving in a stretch of water at the wrong phase of its wind cycle, which in practice meant arriving in the conditions the Odyssey's monsters inhabit. Night sailing was avoided wherever possible, and the reasons were specific rather than general. The Euripus Strait, to take one documented example, narrowed to as little as 38 metres at its tightest point and generated tidal currents up to 12 kilometres per hour, with vortexes forming at flow reversal. Entering that passage at the wrong tidal phase in daylight required skill and timing. Entering it at night, with neither visual reference to the cliff walls nor visible surface turbulence to read the current direction, was effectively a decision to navigate blind into a machine designed to capsize you. Ancient accounts specifically noted that flood tides arriving at night, particularly in the dark of the moon, were among the most reliably lethal conditions a crew could encounter. The Charybdis myth did not need to invent this danger. It needed only to name it, and in naming it, to ensure that every sailor who heard the poem understood that narrow channels and tidal reversals required scheduling, not bravado. Beyond timing and route, Greek sailors read the sea itself as a continuous stream of warning signals. Watercolour was among the most legible. A shift from deep blue to turbid green or brown indicated river outflow, shoaling ground, or the approach of a storm-driven sediment plume, any of which demanded an immediate turn toward shelter. Surf patterns off cliff faces told experienced eyes where submerged reefs extended below the visible breakline, because the wave reflection signature of a hidden reef differs measurably from the reflection signature of open water, a series of irregular, choppy surface disturbances in otherwise calm conditions suggested tidal upwelling over a rocky bottom that a chart might not record. These readings were not passive observation. They were active interrogation of the sea's surface for information the sea was continuously broadcasting. Bird behaviour extended the sensory range still further offshore. Large flocks of land birds heading consistently in one direction indicated a coastline beyond the visible horizon, a practice that ancient navigators appear to have relied upon when coastal landmarks were obscured or when open water crossings required confirmation that land was approaching. Seabirds gathering and calling over a particular patch of water suggested upwelling caused by a submerged ridge, which in practice meant a reef or shoal close enough to the surface to concentrate fish. What looked like a promising fishing ground was also a navigational hazard marker, and experienced crews understood both dimensions of the same signal simultaneously. Map each of these practical skills onto the Odyssey's monsters, and the poem's real function becomes visible with unusual clarity. The Sirens episode is not about the danger of beautiful music. It is a lesson about listening to unfamiliar coastlines with disciplined skepticism, about the discipline required not to follow an ambiguous acoustic signal into an unmarked anchorage before you have verified what is generating it. Odysseus binding himself to the mast is a ritual encoding of the single most important rule in strange waters: do not let an unverified sound pull you off a verified course. The crew's stopped ears encode the next most important rule: protect the people responsible for working the ship from the distraction that leadership has to confront. Scylla at her cliff face encodes the surf reading lesson. The hazard is not the creature herself, but the rock face behind her. The kind of cliff-edge channel where wave reflections mask hidden shoals, and where the instinct to hug the shore for safety is exactly the wrong instinct. Keeping to open water, accepting distance from the familiar solidity of land, was counterintuitive in a tradition built on coast-hugging navigation. The myth made the shoreline itself into a predator to overcome that instinct. Charybdis in the Narrows encodes the tidal timing lesson. The whirlpool does not operate continuously. It pulses, it breathes, it has a rhythm. Ancient sailors understood this. The survival window was the interval between one tidal surge and the next, the moment when the current paused before reversing. Threading Charybdis was not an act of courage, but an act of scheduling and patience, waiting for the precise moment when the channel was navigable, rather than attempting it when the current said otherwise. And underpinning all of it was the lesson the Lotus-eaters encode at the journey's beginning. Local knowledge matters more than confidence. The crew that eats the lotus loses not their courage, but their orientation, their connection to the specific practical geography of home, route, and destination. What the lotus destroys is the navigational mindset itself, the disciplined awareness of where you are, where you came from, and what the sea between those 2 points requires of you. This is why the Odyssey survived as more than entertainment. Strip the divine machinery and the supernatural attribution from its episodes, and what remains is a working handbook of Mediterranean seamanship, a structured curriculum in which every lesson comes packaged in a story terrifying enough to be remembered precisely. The monsters guaranteed the pedagogy, because a sailor who forgot the tidal schedule at Charybdis, or followed an unverified sound toward an unmarked shore, or let fermented cargo impair the judgment of a watch crew, did not simply make an error. He became the kind of story that someone else would eventually turn into a monster. The poem remembered the dead by teaching the living exactly how to avoid becoming them. What kept these monsters alive was not nostalgia, it was geography. The Strait of Messina still has a town called Scylla on its Calabrian shore. A few kilometres south, near the Sicilian edge of the narrowest passage, the area around Ganziri preserves a name that echoes Charybdis through 2.5 millennia of linguistic drift. These are not literary references. They are working place names that appeared on medieval navigation charts, that survived the transition from Greek to Roman to Byzantine to Norman rule of the same coastline, that outlasted every political transformation the region underwent because the cliff and the whirlpool that generated them never moved and never stopped being dangerous. Sailors who had never read Homer still named their hazards after Homer's monsters, because the monsters had been named after the hazards first, and the hazards were still there. The same pattern holds at the Ligali archipelago off the Amalfi coast, still called Le Sirens, the Sirens, a name preserved through medieval Portolan charts and into the modern acoustic studies that found monk seal calls dramatically amplified by the twin rocks. A medieval navigator consulting a sailing manual that listed Le Sirens as a landmark requiring careful passage did not need to know the myth in any literary sense. The name itself was the warning. Place names tied to physical danger function as compressed navigation data, and the older and more stable the hazard, the more tenacious the name attached to it. Near Atti Trezza on the Sicilian coast, the basalt sea stacks are still officially designated the archipelago of the Cyclops, a designation that runs from classical authors through Boccaccio's references in 1365 and Fazello's Sicilian Chronicle of 1558, all the way into modern regional heritage registers. Each generation that passed those rocks in a boat encountered the same silhouettes, the same offshore turbulence, the same volcanic geology that once generated stories about a creature capable of hurling mountainous stones into the sea. The name survived because the rock survived, but geography alone does not explain the monster's endurance. Geography explains why the hazards persisted. Literature explains why the stories about them travelled to places where the specific geography could not follow. Virgil, writing the Aeneid in the 1st century before the Common Era, sent Aeneas through the same waters and warned him, through the prophet Helenus, to sail wide around the Sicilian side rather than risk the straits. The warning is operationally identical to the navigational advice embedded in the Odyssey. Avoid the narrows, read the current, keep distance from the cliff face. But it arrives dressed in the authority of a new Roman literary tradition building on a Greek one. Dante, writing the Divine Comedy in the 14th century, repurposed Scylla and Charybdis as moral allegories, transforming navigational hazards into symbols of excess and destructive oscillation between extremes. By the time Dante writes, the straits, cliffs and whirlpool have become a conceptual vocabulary available to any educated European, a shared reference for danger, choice under pressure, and the consequences of misjudgment, regardless of whether the reader had ever seen the Mediterranean. This is precisely how culturally durable stories work. They begin in specific observable experience. They get encoded in a form, narrative, myth, poem, that is portable enough to travel beyond the original context. And they survive changes in technology, language and geography, because the human experiences they encode remain recognizable even when the specific physical hazard does not. Not every reader of Dante had navigated the Strait of Messina, but every reader of Dante had faced a situation requiring them to choose between two dangers while knowing that choosing neither was not an option. The monsters had migrated from a nautical manual to a moral philosophy, and in doing so they had guaranteed their own immortality. The maritime tradition itself, however, kept the original meaning alive in parallel. Sailors' manuals and oral navigational lore across the Mediterranean continued to personify dangerous coastlines in exactly the idiom Homer had used. Treacherous reefs acquired names. Specific current patterns generated their own local creatures. Figures who pulled ships down, who breathed in the tide, who screamed through particular cliff passages in particular wind conditions. The practice of personifying maritime hazards was not a primitive confusion of natural phenomena with supernatural agents. It was a mnemonic technology, a way of making certain hazard configurations memorable and transmissible without requiring every sailor who needed the information to have experienced the hazard personally. You did not need to have survived a tidal reversal in a narrow channel to understand that Charybdis was lethal if you timed it wrong. You needed to have heard the story well enough to believe it, and to believe it well enough to check the tide before you entered. This is the deeper reason the monsters lasted. They were anchored not just in specific places but in recurring categories of experience that any working sailor would encounter, regardless of which coastline they navigated. Whirlpools appear wherever tidal flow meets a geographic constriction, not only at Messina but at the Euripus, in the Dardanelles, at a dozen less celebrated narrows throughout the Aegean and Adriatic. Rocky cliff passages exist wherever mountains meet the sea. Amplified animal sounds. Confusing a watch crew is a risk on any coast with the right combination of geology and fauna. The lotus that dissolves navigational purpose is available in any port that offers rest long enough to make the sea feel more dangerous than it actually is in the morning. These are not the specific monsters of a specific poem. They are recurring features of maritime existence that the poem had the good sense to name, sequence, and dramatize in ways that made the lessons they contained impossible to forget. What the ancient maritime world understood, and what the Odyssey encodes with a precision that 2,500 years have not eroded, is that myth and observation were never opposites. they were the same cognitive project pursued at different scales. Observation told you what this particular reef did to a hull last season. Myth told you what reefs, as a category of hazard due to hulls across generations, and why the sailor who dismisses the name attached to a stretch of water is making exactly the same mistake as the sailor who dismisses the colour change in the water ahead of him. Both are refusing to read the information the sea is continuously providing. The monsters endured because the sea that generated them never changed its fundamental character. It remained a system of recurring dangers, demanding the same calibrated attention from every generation that attempted to cross it. Homer's poem was the container those lessons travelled in. The monsters were the form those lessons took when the need to remember them was urgent enough to reach for the most unforgettable image available, which for people who made their living on a sea that could kill them in a dozen distinct and well-documented ways, was always a creature terrible enough to make the lesson stick. Pull back from the individual monsters for a moment and look at the full pattern laid out across Odysseus's voyage, because the cumulative picture is striking enough to demand attention on its own terms. The wild jujube fermented into intoxicant that erases the desire to sail home. A volcanic island fringed with concealed approaches and populated by evidence of enormous animals, their massive skulls with a single central cavity transforming in the telling into a one-eyed giant. A sealed bag of compressed Mediterranean storm winds that, opened at the wrong moment, could scatter a fleet across 500 miles of open water with gusts clocked in modern meteorological analysis at the equivalent of violent microburst force. A harbour shaped like a trap, with high walls and a narrow mouth, where concentrated hostile fire from above could destroy an entire squadron before a single hull could reverse course and escape. Twin rocks off a coastline where the configuration of stone naturally amplifies the calls of monk seals into something that carries far enough offshore to be heard before the rocks themselves are visible. A cliff passage where 5-knot tidal currents drag toward a rocky promontory on one side and generate periodic vortex action on the other, with the narrowest navigable gap between them demanding precise timing and nerve. The open ocean's largest animals, 60 feet of baleen whale surfacing without warning to breathe, diving and resurfacing in patterns that ancient mariners had no existing category to absorb except through the vocabulary of the monstrous. Each individual identification has a margin of uncertainty. The connection between the Cyclops and the dwarf elephant fossils of Sicily remains genuinely debated. Some scholars prefer a volcanic island interpretation, reading Polyphemus as a personification of volcanic force rather than a misread skeleton. The monk seal hypothesis for the Sirens, while supported by acoustic field experiments on the Lee Galley Islands, is not universally accepted and competes with alternative explanations centered on the rocks themselves generating sound in specific wind conditions. No single identification is airtight. That caveat is important and honest, and it should be stated plainly. But here is what matters. The uncertainty applies at the level of individual identifications, not at the level of the overall pattern. You can debate whether it was seal calls or wind-channeled acoustics that inspired the Sirens without weakening the central observation that the location is precisely where ships would be approaching dangerous reefs while processing disorienting sound. You can dispute the fossil connection to the Cyclops, while still noting that the island in question sits within Sicily's volcanic zone, and that the approaches to it carry real navigational hazards that any Bronze Age sailor would have encountered. Individual threads may be contested. The fabric they form is not. What the Odyssey presents, when you map its sequence of encounters against the actual geography and natural phenomena of the eastern and central Mediterranean, is something that functions far less like an adventure story and far more like a memory palace of maritime dangers. The term is worth unpacking. A memory palace is a structured architecture for encoding information that must be retained and transmitted reliably. You place vivid images at specific locations along a mental route, and the images are deliberately extreme, memorable because they are strange, frightening, or excessive, because those qualities make them stick in ways that plain description does not. This is precisely what Homer's monsters accomplish. Charybdis is not described as a tidal vortex caused by the interaction of opposing currents in a constricted channel, which is accurate but forgettable. She's described as a creature who inhales the sea 3 times a day and expels it in a boiling surge, which is memorable enough that 2,500 years have not loosened its grip. The information encoded in both descriptions is functionally identical to a sailor who needs to know that entering this strait at the wrong tidal moment is fatal. One version survives the transmission intact, the other does not. The ancient sailors who first told these stories were not confused about the distinction between natural phenomena and supernatural agents. They were making a deliberate choice about the most effective container for hazard knowledge, a choice that the poem's subsequent survival across 2.5 millennia suggests was exactly correct. This is why the monsters were terrifying in a way that a purely literary reading cannot fully account for. They were terrifying because the people who first heard these stories had already met them in another form. They had watched a whale surface 20 feet from the hull in open water and understood with absolute bodily certainty that nothing in their vessel's construction was a match for that mass in motion. They had heard sound carrying across dark water from a coastline they could not yet see, and made decisions about course corrections on the basis of what that sound might mean. They had felt a current shift under the keel in a narrow passage and known, without being able to articulate the hydrodynamics, that the water was doing something that required immediate response. Homer gave those experiences names, sequences, and a hero whose survival depended on taking them seriously. The nightmare was never beneath the myth. The myth was always the nightmare, translated into the only form ancient sailors had found reliable enough to carry the warning forward, which was the most unforgettable story they knew how to tell.